You may have seen our recent episode where we built these raised beds, and now it's time to plant them. Now I know many of you probably have already planted your garden at this point in the late spring, early summer, but if you haven't, you might want to think about some succession planting, especially when it comes to summer squash. A lot of times when we mention squash, one of the first things that come to mind are squash bugs. And while the best mechanical way to handle those squash bugs is simply and appropriately named squashing them, the second best way is to just succession plant. And that means to plant a second crop of squash a few weeks after your first crop of squash that you planted. By doing this, by the time that the squash bug attack your first crop, you're going to be harvesting from your second crop. So it won't be too much of a concern when they take that first crop. So here we've got some summer squash that we're going to plant, both yellow squash and also zucchini. Now, a lot of times, you know, those are both referred to as summer squash, and a lot of times we think of them very similarly because they do taste similar, and you can actually use them interchangeably in a recipe. Now, the difference though is a lot of times we think, well, one's yellow and one's green. But actually, did you know that there is a golden zucchini that we have right here that we'll be planting? So color doesn't always necessarily differentiate the two. What you want to look at is the shape. A yellow squash is going to have a tapered neck. Now that can either be crooked or a straight neck squash, and it's going to have a flat bottom to it. Our zucchini, on the other hand, is more cylindrical. You can see that there isn't any taper towards the neck of it. So that's the main difference between the two. Also, yellow squash tend to have a lot more seeds in the center of them. So that's why you want to pick those younger, because it'll kind of reduce the amount of seeds in your recipe. Now, the golden zucchini that I mentioned tends to have a little bit of a sweeter flavor, they say. So we'll find out about that. We're going to go ahead and plant these, and a lot of times when you get a plant like this, they put several seeds in here. So you can see we actually have 4 plants that are coming up. Now, the concern about this is if you planted all of them, they're going to be competition for one another. If you're trying to get a little more bang out of your buck, you might try to divide those, but when you do that, you can potentially damage those roots and damage the stems. So one of the best things to do is figure out which one looks like the strongest plant and just go ahead and break off the tops of the others. This way you're keeping your root ball intact and you're not having to worry about damaging that plant that you want to save. So we'll go ahead and plant this here in the center. It didn't have too much of a root ball that we needed to tease apart or anything. We want to make sure to plant that at the level that it was in the pot. Now these squash don't vine too extensively, so they're perfect for our raised beds here. The other nice thing about them being elevated is it's going to give us a little bit better perspective on checking those squash bugs. Of course, we've got to plant some tomatoes in our raised beds, and we have a couple of different varieties that we're planting. Some are determinate, which means they're going to stay so big, which are perfect and ideal for a raised bed. Some are indeterminate, which means they're going to grow taller and we will need to stake those. Now, a lot of times when I'm talking about planting plants, we say make sure to plant them at the same depth that you bring them out of the container. Now, tomatoes are the exception to that because they grow adventitious roots along the stems. So what you'll want to do is you can actually plant these a little bit lower. If you find that you have a smaller root ball or maybe a plant that's a little tall and you're worried about the wind snapping that off, what you can do is actually plant these deeper. Now, this is not typically recommended for other plants, but with tomatoes it's okay. And there's 2 ways to do that. One is kind of the trench layer where you lay it on its side, and then you want to remove any of the leaves that would be down in the ground and just kind of bend it upwards. So all of that is underground. And then this plant will continue to grow up right here. Meanwhile, that stem that's buried will grow more roots, giving you a larger root ball and also minimizing the risk of it snapping off in the wind. Now, another way to plant tomatoes a little bit deeper is, again, we've got pretty good roots here. You see I need to tease them a little bit to get them out. We're gonna tease them once we do have it out, just so that they continue to grow into the soil and not circle around in that pot shape. Another way to do this is simply just to bury it deeper. So here, again, we're going to remove those stems, or excuse me, those leaves that would be below ground. And we've just buried it deeper in the ground. Once again, reducing the overall size of the plant so that the wind doesn't take it away or snap it, and allowing those roots to grow bigger down below. Now you can see we've planted some herbs, or we're going to plant some herbs with our tomatoes. I think a lot of times when we think about tomatoes, we think about different salsas and salads that we can make, and some chives and some basil is what we're going to add to our tomato garden here. Here we've got some peppers that we're going to plant, and while these are all new beds, when you're planting any crop, you want to make sure to plant them in a different location than the crop was planted the previous year. And that's because of disease and bugs. Now, we're not just talking about the crops, because peppers are in the same plant family as tomatoes and tomatillos and eggplants. They're all in the Solanaceae family. So you also want to make sure to rotate the whole plant family. So next year we might plant the peppers where the squash were, because they're in a different plant family. They're in the Cucurbitaceae family. So here you can see peppers can go a little bit closer together. We've got 4 in here, and we're going to plant these just like we would do any of the other plants. You do want to make sure they're at the same level as the plant. Tease any of the roots that might be tight, and we'll get those in the ground. Some people are concerned about cross-pollination between hot peppers and sweet peppers, or between their yellow neck squash and their zucchini. But really that only affects the seeds. So if you are a seed saver and you plant those seeds the following year, then that can affect those plants that you'll be growing next year. Here we've got a couple of tomatillos that we're going to plant, and you might recognize these as what they call husk tomato, or they look like a little green tomato. Now the plant itself tends to look more like an eggplant, and that's because they're all in the same plant family. They're in the Solanaceae family. Now if you are planting tomatillos to make some green verde, salsa verde or something, you want to make sure that you plant 2 plants, because they need a second plant in order to cross-pollinate. So that's important to keep in mind when you're planting tomatillos. When you're planting, you want to make sure if it came with a label to get that label put in with that plant. You might be able to distinguish a yellow squash from a zucchini once you start seeing the fruit come on the plant, but you definitely don't want to mistake a ghost pepper for a bell pepper. So if it doesn't come with a label, make sure to go ahead and write one to include in those plants.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.